It's the busiest time of the year for Canada's airports. Millions are traveling by plane ahead of Christmas, and that congestion means there will be plenty of room for flight delays, cancellations, and lost baggage. The federal government has just unveiled the long-awaited details of its so-called Passenger Bill of Rights, aimed at addressing those very situations. Say your flight is delayed. Depending on how long that delay is, the passenger would be eligible for anywhere between $400 and $1,000. If you're bumped from an overbooked flight, that airline would have to compensate the passenger up to $2,400. And if the airline loses your luggage or damages it, it would have to reimburse you for as much as $2,100. Also, if your plane is stuck on a tarmac for up to 3 hours, there has to be working washrooms now, proper ventilation, Wi-Fi, and food and drink. After 3 hours, the plane has to return to the gate. If an airline breaks any of those rules, the government says it will be subject to fines, and the rules won't take effect immediately. Canadians have 2 months to comment on the proposed changes. When they are formalized, how will the government make sure airlines abide by the rules? Transport Minister Marc Garneau joins me from Ottawa's airport. Hi, Minister Garneau. Thanks for being with us.
Nice to be with you, Vashi.
Minister, according to the new regulations, draft regulations, Canadians who sit for hours on a tarmac because of specifically a maintenance issue aren't entitled to any compensation. Why is that?
In actual fact, what we've said is that after 3 hours, they'll have the opportunity to disembark. And we will be making sure that during the 3 hours that they are in the airplane, that they're well treated in terms of services such as going to the bathroom, having access to communications, air conditioning, food and water, those things. And so that is a very clear undertaking that we'll be putting in the passenger rights.
So it doesn't matter if the reason for that is maintenance? Because I'm sure you're aware that passenger advocates have already raised that as sort of a loophole in the regulations that were announced today, that if the cause is maintenance as deemed by the airport, I heard the CAA describe it today, by the airline, then they do not have to dole out compensation.
So you're talking about a safety problem that's detected on the airplane when it comes to pick up passengers. Obviously, we don't want to play around with safety. Safety is paramount. And in situations where a problem occurs, let's say during the pre-flight checks, they notice that there is a problem. Those things can occur, and we don't want to take any chances with respect to safety. In a situation like that, there will be a requirement not for compensation, but for providing standards of treatment for the passengers and rebooking them. This is exactly the same model that exists in the United States. And in fact, in Europe, although at the moment, when the Europeans put in place their regulations, they weren't sufficiently clear, courts challenged it, and they obtained compensation. But the European Union is in the process of changing the regulations to put them in the same category as Canada and the United States, because they recognize that in the case of safety that you can't take any chances, and so that's being changed in Europe as well.
Are airlines free, though, to define what a maintenance issue is, or will it be defined by the CTA, for example, and who will enforce whether or not, in fact, it was a maintenance issue?
It will be the CTA, the Canadian Transport Agency, but also Transport Canada monitors all these things. They're all monitored, the aircraft. For example, if there is a maintenance problem when the airplane is in the hangar, and as a result of that, it's late or has to cancel when it is receiving scheduled maintenance, that will be considered within the responsibility of the airline, and they will have to provide compensation if that airplane does not arrive. But the Canadian Transportation Agency and Transport Canada monitor everything that happens with every aircraft. So we will know whether or not, what the circumstances were surrounding an issue related to maintenance or a safety problem.
With all these new regulations, are you expecting the cost of enforcement to increase? And if so, is your government prepared to increase the amount of resources going towards enforcement?
We think that they'll be minimal. They could, in some cases, really not be there. It depends on how the airlines treat the issue of overbooking. It depends how good their record is with respect to delays or cancellations. Look, the important thing here is to recognize that when you buy a ticket, it can be expensive. If you buy it for your family, it can be a big expenditure, that the airlines have an obligation. There's a contract that has been signed. You've paid a lot of money for it, and your rights have to be respected when it's within the control of the airline. We're doing this for the first time in Canada, and if you look at our rules and compare them with the European rules in their entirety and the American rules, you'll see that the Canadian rules are actually the most demanding and the best rules in the world.
I understand that. I'm just wondering that, there have been rules in existence for a while, and I'm just wondering with these, if you're saying these are going to be some of the most wide-ranging in the world, are you prepared, if necessary, to devote more resources to enforcing those rules? Because passenger advocates have said the problem so far has been enforcement.
Well, let me pick you up on that, Vashi. There have not been federal rules with respect to passenger rights that apply to all airlines. Individual airlines may have put in certain rules in their tariff, which is the thing that comes with your ticket that says what their obligations are. But that was up to them to do it. There was no uniform standard. Canada, for the first time now, will have rules that apply to all airlines, and they will have to be respected. They will be in clear, simple language for people to understand. They'll know what their rights are, and I think that is a much better situation. We think it's fair, clear, open, and transparent.
With respect, Minister, I appreciate your point, but that doesn't answer the question of whether your government is prepared to put more money into enforcement should that be necessary.
We already follow everything that the airlines do. And another part of the regulations that will come out on Saturday, which I didn't talk about today, is the requirement for airlines to provide us with more data on their individual flights, their on-time record, their delays, the reasons for the delays, those things which we follow anyway. And we will have a fulsome knowledge of the situation with respect to each airline. When there is a delay or a cancellation, we will know exactly why, and the Canadian Transportation Agency will be doing exactly the same thing. So the situation is such that we already have the resources in place to monitor our Canadian airlines.
And finally, before I let you go, Minister, is there any kind of guarantee that the airlines won't pass on any of these costs to customers?
There is no guarantee from that point of view. If they do, and knowing that they work in an extremely competitive environment, it may entail a certain penalty on their part if they decide to pass those on. So we're hoping that the new rules will be in place and not result in more expensive airfares in an extremely competitive environment, especially with some of the other measures that we brought in, which is allowing the creation of low-cost carriers to come into Canada. So we think that the effect will be minimal, especially if the airlines decide that they will avoid some of the measures that will require them to pay compensation.
Sorry, can I just ask you quickly to clarify what you meant by penalty if they do pass on those costs? Do you mean penalty vis-a-vis the government, or
no.
What do you mean?
No. It's they run a business, a very competitive business. If they decide to increase fares, then they make themselves less competitive with respect to their competitors. That's what I'm saying.
All right. Thank you so much, Minister. Really appreciate it.
You're most welcome, Vashi.
Gabor Lukacs has been fighting for a passenger Bill of Rights for years. He's an air passenger rights advocate, and I spoke to him earlier from Halifax. Hi, Mr. Lukacs. Nice to see you. Thanks for your time.
Good evening.
Let me get your quick take. Is this new set of draft regulations, is it good news for passengers?
This is bad news. The government is clawing back on the rights of passengers under the disguise of an air passenger bill. This is a slap on the face of Canadians.
Okay, let me ask you to expand on that first. Give me some detail as to why you think that's the case. Why? I mean, the government is presenting this as we've got more regulations. There are fines if your bags go lost. There are fines for staying over 3 hours on the tarmac, things along those lines. Why is that bad news for passengers from your perspective?
Let's first clarify, there are no fines. Airlines have never been fined for breaking the rights of passengers. That's part and parcel of the problem, the lack of enforcement. But as for what is in the regulations, first of all, the regulations confirm the doubling, in fact more than doubling, the amount of time passengers can be kept on an aircraft on the tarmac from 90 minutes to more than 3 hours. That is simply inhumane. Second, the proposed regulations relieve airlines from compensating passengers if a flight is delayed or cancelled due to the airline's own maintenance problems. If the aircraft breaks down, the airline can claim it was a safety issue and just not pay compensation. It results in an unenforceable, unverifiable scheme.
I want to ask you about enforcement in a second, but let me ask you also about the point about maintenance, because I did ask the minister about that. I guess you could call it a loophole. And he said, well, that's the way the U.S. does it as well, and the system works there. What's your response to that?
Minister Garneau is mistaken. In the U.S. and across the world, the Montreal Convention is the leading regime. Under the Montreal Convention, most maintenance issues are not exceptional circumstances. They don't relieve the airline from paying compensation. I personally obtained a judgment in 2009 against an airline when the aircraft broke down under the Montreal Convention. So when you look at the European regime, which incorporates and further develops the Montreal Convention, it is settled law that when an aircraft breaks down and the passenger is delayed or cancelled, the airline has to pay compensation. No questions, no excuses. The only time an airline can avoid paying compensation in Europe is if it was, say, a volcanic eruption or a snowstorm or an act of terrorism, sabotage, or if all planes of a given model are grounded. But if it is only one airline's, one plane, not something affecting all airlines equally, it is the airline's own problem. It is their aircraft, their fleet, they are responsible for maintenance.
You also touched on enforcement or lack thereof, and I asked the minister about that a couple of times. And basically the premise of my question was, if you are bringing in all these new rules, are you prepared, if necessary, to devote more resources to enforcement? I want to play a clip of what he had to say and then get your response. Take a listen.
We're doing this for the first time in Canada, and if you look at our rules and compare them with the European rules in their entirety and the American rules, you'll see that the Canadian rules are actually the most demanding and the best rules in the world. We already have the resources in place to monitor our Canadian airlines.
So let me drill down again into that last portion of the minister's answers. We already have the resources in place to monitor our Canadian airlines. What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, the rules are far superior in Europe than in Canada, so the minister is mistaken as to that. In terms of resources, what is missing in Canada is the will to enforce the rules. Rules have been on the law books for decades. For example, it is unlawful to mislead passengers about their rights. It carries a fine of $25,000 for each incident. Yet, not a single fine has ever been issued on that basis by the Canadian Transportation Agency. So it is the appetite for enforcing the law that is missing and will continue to be missing, and not the resources.
Where is that appetite missing from? Is it the political will? Like, should it come from the government? Is it the CTA? Is it where do you find, if that is the case, that the appetite is lacking?
Both. We have a transportation minister who has taken away rights from Canadians to make airlines more profitable. And we have a Canadian Transportation Agency that has been refusing in practice to enforce the rights of passengers. Rights that are already on the law books, that are already known, and all it would take is an enforcement officer who is willing to do their job. They have adjudicators who adjudicate disputes between passengers and airlines, but as it turns out, one of those adjudicators is actually married to a lawyer who is on the airline's payroll. So we don't have an independent, impartial adjudication of complaints. Passengers with valid complaints are being turned away by the Canadian Transportation Agency, and they are not using the substantive enforcement powers that the law already confers on the Canadian Transportation Agency. They can issue fines for, in some cases, up to $10,000, in some cases up to $25,000 per incident. If those powers were used, airlines would very quickly start complying with the law, but they are not being used.
These are draft regulations that are open now for public comment. Do you plan to submit your comments, and what's your level of optimism that the final rules will better reflect, I guess, some of the concerns that come forward?
We will be making submissions, but we have no hope in reality that they will be actually listened to. You have to bear in mind that those regulations, those legislation that have been pushed through Parliament have been criticized and opposed by the Senate. The Senate told Minister Garneau that those regulations, that entire framework that he came up with was inadequate. Senate told Garneau that keeping passengers on the tarmac for 90 minutes is the maximum. He should not allow airlines to hold passengers captive on the tarmac for 3 hours or more. But Minister Garneau chose to ignore those warnings and just reintroduce the bill. So we have a minister, a government, and a Canadian Transportation Agency that is clearly not willing to listen to what the public has to say, to what concerns Senate had, and we anticipate that this additional round of consultation is another dog and pony show.
To be fair to the government, I mean, that is their prerogative, and they have in other cases. You know, the Senate will propose amendments and they will ignore them. And on the point that you brought up about 3 hours, and I take your point that it is double what was originally, 90 minutes to 3 hours on the tarmac. The minister says, well, during those 3 hours, we've now ensured that there will be food and water, there will be Wi-Fi, there's a whole host of conditions that need to be met if, in fact, the plane is there for 3 hours.
It is entirely irrelevant because if you think of someone who is a person with disabilities or a little child, it is not the food necessarily that they are missing, but possibly the actual real ability to go to the bathroom. When you are wheelchair bound, and I've heard it from the Canadian Council of Disabilities, and you sign up to have a 2-hour flight, you don't sign up to have a 5-hour flight, which would be 3 hours of tarmac delay plus 2 hours of flight. So this creates significant problems for families with small children, for passengers with disabilities, and there is no justification for it other than catering to the airline industry.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Mr. Lew Catch.
Thank you very much for having me.